Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be taking a look at the Michelangelo, a Tier 8 premium Italian cruiser, I guess. In this review I'll start with some history, talk about the ship in game, discuss commanders, run down the stats with you, and then we'll finish off with some gameplay. If you want to skip around, there are time codes down below to help you out. Brief history of the Michelangelo is that it's named after Michelangelo Buonarroti, a famous Florentine sculptor who also served as chief military engineer for the Republic during its defense of a siege laid by the Holy Roman Empire. Now granted, he first fled the city, but he did come back. I'm sure the only thing really surprising here about this is probably that Michelangelo was doing things other than painting or sculpting. He was also in charge of the city's fortifications, and the reason I bring this up at the very beginning is to say I'm going to pronounce this as the anglicized Michelangelo throughout this review, and to take away any confusion that this ship is named after the walking, talking kung fu tortoise. In any case, naming a battleship for an artist or an architect was probably never in the cards. The Regia Marina never did it, nor did its military forefathers or successor navy of the Italian state. That said, it does match up with the headcanon that Wargaming is putting out there when we have ships named for famous composers and explorers. The Michelangelo in-game is based on one of the series of designs that were developed in the interwar period that were intended to fill a medium or intermediate tonnage battleship. These designs would have, in theory, been Italy's answer to the Dunkirk class of battleships, hence the target weight of 26,500 tons, and presumably there was some faint consideration to drop the allowable tonnage under the Second London Naval Treaty to something in this sort of area. Now, it is worth mentioning that these studies were going on concurrently with the pre-planning for the Littorio class of battleships, and done with the hopes of getting something as close to Littorio's capabilities, but on a ship that ended up somehow 25% lighter, still fast, and still reasonably well armored. 3x3 arrangements were considered, as well as 2 quad turrets. This was obviously not going to work with 15-inch guns, and the choice here of 320 may seem a bit odd, but remember that the Dunkirk only has 330mm guns, and the Italians did already have experience with 320s. They were on the Conte di Cavour class of battleships. The design we see represented here as Michelangelo is one of the more non-traditional designs, but there were others that included mirroring the oil tanker design of the Nelson class, as well as other traditional layouts. Placing all of the guns amidship pushed much of the secondary battery forward or behind the main battery and would limit the amount of the ship that would need to be heavily armored. Even if you were trying to make a traditional battlecruiser rather than a medium displacement battleship that did traditional battlecruiser things, this isn't as wildly silly as it looks in game. And I think it's worth mentioning here that contemporary sources also refer to the Dunkirk as a battlecruiser with some regularity. So we may just call Michelangelo a battlecruiser here and there along the way. Anyway, presumably, if you've got 6-inch guns that can fire straight forward, those guns are still a threat to anything that would consider it a good idea to run away from this thing. The problem probably comes when you want to fight anything that doesn't want to run away with this, because the Americans still have a few 16-inch battleships out there, and the British have a few 15-inch ships too, not to mention HMS Hood, which is about 20,000 tons heavier than this thing, and also faster, and also with better armor. Not to belabor the point, this thing isn't going to be able to hang into the battle line, whether willingly or unwillingly, and as designed, they were expected to be even less well protected than the Dunkirk that it was designed to defeat. And it's also worth mentioning that the secondaries weren't supposed to be 152mm guns. They were meant to be between 13 and 14 centimeters. And it's at least a decent guess, had this been built, that they would have been designed with the same 135mm guns found on some light cruisers. This design presumes what appears to be a non-existent variation of the same main battery found on the Garibaldi-type Condottieri class cruisers, which also served as the secondary battery on the Littorio class once built. You may be wondering why the Italians didn't go with this design. Actually, I'm pretty sure that you're not, but let's just entertain the question. no one was really all that interested in lowering the displacement of battleships. It was already hard enough to build a functional battleship on 35,000 tons, but as these designs developed alongside the Littorios, both designs featured a Pugliese torpedo system, and the weight of both designs was revised upward. Italy determined that with the French moving on from the Dunkirk to the Richelieu class, it was a better idea to pursue the Littorio designs, though they would do so outside of the Second London Naval Treaty, which is just as well because they're way better looking ships. Anyway, how does Michelangelo perform in the game? You're going to hear me struggle to compare this to much of anything, which is partly because of its layout, but mostly because everything else that it does is quite a bit different than what every other ship does, unless you boil it all the way down to move around the map and fire weapons at stuff. As far as what makes Michelangelo special, she's got 320mm guns, and you get to squeeze that into a cruiser space. In theory, that allows for some possibilities when playing in special game modes, if that's your thing. But even in standard battle, they have a way of doing unexpected damage. And I say that because if you properly bide your time, sometimes you can get a cruiser to turn just so, right in front of you at medium range, and they don't even know you're there. For a flanker, having large guns, and in this case, legitimately good sea detectability, goes a long way towards scoring big hits. The excellent concealment can also get you closer to the action if what you want to do is play with your secondaries. They're SAP, they hit very hard, and they actually have some pretty great range. If you put anything into that, it can be quite a little terror at medium range, especially since you have a secondary targeting consumable. Unfortunately, even folks who really like the idea of sneaking a set of 320mm guns inside of 9 kilometers of an enemy, somehow unnoticed, may still find the ship just aggravating to play. The short story is that you can't shoot backwards, which isn't unheard of, but you also can't shoot forward. Yes, both turrets are 360, so provided it isn't one of the many times one of them is disabled, you shouldn't be waiting for your guns to swing into position, but there's a good chance when they get there, there's going to be a part of your own boat that's in the way. That might actually make it somewhat easier to avoid some of Michelangelo's other issues in her protection, that being that she has an above-water citadel and lightly armored extremities. Even if Michelangelo could shoot directly forward, almost every battleship overmatches her bow and stern. Similarly, if your solution to the firing angle issue with her main battery is to just go broadside, your experience with Michelangelo is probably not going to fare much better than the historic Regia Marina during the war, though it's worth mentioning if you're playing her with at least a 45-degree angle, either in or out, the sides of the ship can bounce most shots. And it's worth mentioning as we come to commanders that Wargaming has an interesting suggestion for how to run this ship, and I will address that shortly, but only after I mention there is really no good commander for this ship if you think the best reason to play this ship is its secondaries, because you're going to run into the same problem with every commander. The key here is secondary mod in slot 1 and the inspirations to further increase the range, here listed as Franz von Hipper. These not only stack but are multiplied atop one another. And what they're suggesting here might be the most entertaining way to play this ship, because cruisers mostly don't do this, and watching secondaries pop off is sexy. But it's only the most fun right up until you get to the post-battle screens and you realize that the damage that you do with secondaries is heavily penalized. It's just a peculiar thing to suggest, because they are not only aware that this penalty exists, but arguably are the ones who are also imposing it. In any case, if you want to do this, I have it on good authority that you can get a secondary range above 10 kilometers if you really want to. Just run the full meme build, and you do that by putting someone like Paulo di Rivelle on, choosing Porcupine, all of the normal other secondary stuff, and then just never look at how bad a player the game thinks you are at the end of the match. And heck, if you're playing a special game mode where all you need to do is win, that doesn't even matter. Outside of that, the best gun performance is going to come from Sansonetti, whether that is with AP and HE, but especially if you want to take up the game's offer of SAP. Now, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but he can also offset the longer reload for equipping SAP. You end up with the best pen and best range with him, and overall a fairly acceptable amount of accuracy if you want it. But the further away you play, the less use you're going to get out of those powerful secondaries or torpedoes. So think about that if you're trying to play Michelangelo above 15 kilometers. Mimbelli, on the other hand, is going to do nothing to improve your gun performance, other than maybe help your turret rotation feel more cruiser-like. They're 360, so it doesn't usually matter all that much, and other than that, he does provide standard sorts of damage reduction that you'd expect. But it is worth mentioning that he does offer you the best opportunity to make this ship fast. So maybe you're more likely to get into those secondary engagements, and the modest increase he can give to all of your modules may help make it so that a few more of your secondaries are still working when you get there. Just like on other ships, Campione makes this ship absurdly stealthy, considering you're running around with 12.5-inch guns. The modest increase to both range and speed also probably round out the ship in ways that the more specialized cruiser commanders can't, though emphasis on keeping your rudder or engine in play aren't as necessary on Michelangelo versus the more traditionally squishy Italian cruisers. And as we jump into stats, this is really going to be all over the place because Michelangelo isn't really a cruiser. In terms of survivability, the 66,100 hit points for this medium displacement battleship is pretty good when you compare it to the cruiser space that she takes up in game. That's greater than 17,000 more than average, just a bit healthier than Carnot, and gives her the silver medal behind Kronstadt for most HP for a cruiser, in quotes. Her armor shares familiar battlecruiser characteristics, and the midsection of the ship is actually pretty well protected from the okay-ish 255mm belt, 100m casemate, and 40mm upper belt and deck. Functionally, 40mm is penetrable by AP bombs, but thanks to the central location of your turrets, a lot of the vulnerability is covered up. The 40mm deck can skip any battleship shell in the game, at least at the correct ranges, so best practice remains similar to other battlecruisers. Keep a good angle and try your best to guide shells into the parts of your armor scheme that can take those hits. Driving straight on or completely broadside isn't going to work because you have a narrow but very tall citadel which seems to come out of the water just a couple meters. And the reason I said you have an okay-ish belt is because between the belt and the void behind it, you actually can eat up some cruiser shells in the space that is meant to represent the Pugliese torpedo protection system. But if you try this trick with a battleship, you'll often get exactly what you deserve: a complimentary ticket back to the port of your choosing. But while we're on the subject of the torpedo system, it grants you a pretty good 22% reduction, and I do mean pretty good for a cruiser. Michelangelo's artillery is an interesting case that really highlights how numbers can be deceptive. And what I mean by that is DPM is typically calculated as though the ship can fire. A few ships like Richelieu have a blind spot, but most ships can get at least one gun on target at any angle, while about half of the space around you is a blind spot for Michelangelo, and there's no angle that you can shoot while presenting an auto bounce. Anyway, the ship is rocking 8 320mm main battery in 2 turrets, firing every 21.5 seconds. The 35% fire chance makes you an almost average fire starter, even if 4,700 damage leaves you towards the back of the pack for HE damage over time. You can swap this out for SAP instead, and that will almost completely take you out of the damage over time game. Instead, you'd end up with 9,500 SAP penetrating shells, and it's mostly pointless to compare this. The DPM sits comfortably 50% higher than Brindisi, but it's also just a bit over 50% of Vallejo, which would make it a distant second, I guess. Even if it is worth mentioning, you can drop massive amounts of damage, even absent full penetrations, with a well-timed shot before retreating behind cover. If you choose that, you will reduce the AP DPM by almost 10% when reload jumps to 24 seconds. It's a trade-off since these guns are very punishing to poorly angled cruisers, but the AP is not much less worthwhile against battleships, whether angled or not. That is to say that you can citadel many battleships, but when tested at 10 kilometers, the effectiveness of any amount of angling much less a turtleback and or spaced armor, was pretty obvious. In either case, the DPM is either going to be low or very low, depending on whether you choose SAP shells. But speaking of SAP, you have SAP secondaries, and they are really quite good. Starting out with 6.5 kilometer range, you can reach out plenty far. You also come with these 3 turrets mounting 4 6-inch guns. Now you won't ever really get the 3600 damage that's listed here, but you can easily see, even at 50% damage, it's not going to take that many hits against a lightly armored cruiser, or in particular a destroyer, before that becomes a significant emotional event. Add to that 5 twin 90mm turrets on each side of the ship, which do less damage per hit, but against lightly armored targets, it's just going to make their day that much worse. And at least according to Wargaming, these enjoy a relatively high level of accuracy. I assume for secondaries, not for an actual person. Also, like a lot of Italian ships, you do come with torpedoes, though in this case they don't really play like Italians. They have a pretty short 8-kilometer range, so that generally means that the ship you're shooting at will be aware of your existence. They travel a very good 72 knot speed and hit for over 20,000 damage. And for a cruiser, that's all pretty good. The angles are pretty competitive with German cruisers and battle cruisers, and like those ships, you aren't typically firing these from stealth. With only 1 triple launcher on each side, they're probably not used for speculation. If you do, they have a punitively long 2-minute reload. So yeah, I'd save these for a target that you can hit, or keep them in your pocket just to dissuade a battleship from running around a corner on you. The Michelangelo's AA is unimpressive, and as an Italian ship, that might only be surprising if you thought that this would be totally tragic. The overall DPS here is 324, which is almost average, with the vast majority of it coming in at 3.5 or 4 kilometers. Bad news is that at 4 kilometers max range, this is only going to make aircraft pay a toll for having already hit your ship, and that's why it ends up with a poor rating on the screen. And it's also exactly why carriers keep picking on you in this ship. You're big and not particularly well defended, but you do move around more or less like a cruiser. 33.5 knots is pretty dead average. The 830 meter turning circle is a little wide, but noticeably better than Carnot, Aegir, or anything Soviet, even the actual cruisers. Your 10.8 second rudder is also pretty average, so though you are a big target, you have at least a reasonable ability to get out of the way. You also have the ability to avoid getting shot at if you really want to. Though you might not expect it, Michelangelo is granted fantastic concealment, like actual Italian cruisers. You're 800 meters less visible than the average cruiser, and sneak in with better detectability than even Neptune. You're still 600 meters worse than if you were playing Brindisi, but that ship isn't trying to hide 12.5-inch artillery. You've got similarly good concealment by air, and a totally inexplicable 7.4 kilometer firing penalty from smoke, which compares pretty favorably to Aegir, Carnot, Kronstadt, or Schroeder, each of which have over a 10 kilometer firing penalty. So, that's nice. When we jump to consumables, Michelangelo certainly has a place in the clown car mafia with a creative collection of consumables. Starting out with your damage control, you should be happy that this resembles other Italian cruisers with a 1-minute recharge, but otherwise just does what damage control parties do. After that, you have a legitimate choice between 2 heals, which are the totally standard 5% for 28 second type of affair, but it's nice to be able to recover some hit points. Or you can go for 2 charges of sonar, which is similarly average for a cruiser at tier 8. What makes this interesting is that you also have smoke, and it's of the exhaust type, so if you really wanted to, you could pop off of smoke, drive into 4.7 kilometers, and spot for yourself, while holding off shooting with your main batteries, which is something you might have to do, because if you're driving even mostly towards an enemy, you probably can't even get your guns on target without a part of your ship being in the way. Okay, we're getting off track. But in this case, what you're doing is more or less counting on your secondary batteries to do the work until you can torpedo something. You even have a third consumable, your secondary targeting consumable, which is going to actually make this work even better. That's remarkable because not all that many cruisers get them, and you get more of them than you probably are going to have a legitimate opportunity to use. And then you've noticed I basically mentioned all of the consumables except for DFAA. You could choose DFAA rather than sonar or heal, but you shouldn't let fear control you. That's no way to live your life, and it's certainly no way to play Michelangelo. I'm just kidding. You do whatever you want. Anyway, we're going to be on Scandinavia. We're going to be in Michelangelo, and I'll go ahead and put my commander up on the screen. You can tell pretty immediately that I am not going for any sort of meme build. What I am trying to do is just play the game. In this case, we have, a pretty good amount of survivability, but this really isn't doing much for the ship other than that. Now, you may be wondering what's going on the rest of the screen, which is maybe the part of the screen you're paying attention to. But what I'm trying to gauge is how to get around this particular Yamato, who seems to be moving at 1/4 speed forward. I was not 100% sure I could make the turn. I probably could have if I had just gunned it. And we're going to go ahead and end up crossing behind him. We don't get in his way, and we pay the price with, a free 2,400 damage or so. And, yeah, that's unfortunate. Getting a glimpse of Sumner, we go ahead, put some shells out there. You can kind of see not a super tight grouping there. And you'll find when playing this ship, particularly if you don't do anything to try to control for its accuracy, that it can be very accurate, and it can be very not accurate too. Which is to say, I do believe this does have a pretty big dispersion and a not super terrible sigma. Something like that. Some would just leave it at battlecruiser dispersion, but fine. With our second set of shells, we go ahead, put those out there also on Sumner, and come away with one hit, which is also fire, which is nice because we're getting a little bit of damage over time. That's something you're not going to get if you do choose to go with SAP, though you would probably start with a considerably higher initial damage. I would say that what's happening to the destroyer right now is pretty atypical from the results that you can expect from a destroyer, not only because you usually don't get to shoot them that much, but you also have to compound that with you're probably not going to hit them, and they're probably going to have a damage control ready. Anyway, he burns his Damicon again, and we come away with 3,100 total. Nothing much to write home about at this point, so we're sailing a little bit towards this Grosse Kurfürst, and you can see I briefly pull up the menu just to see what the heck is my range, because it doesn't feel that good, and it isn't that good. It's actually fairly low for a cruiser, and it's quite a bit lower than you'd expect for something that has basically battleship caliber guns. They are small battleship caliber guns, but they're bigger guns nonetheless. Minotaur way out there. We think about it for about a second, but we have HE loaded, so not a great target. And as we sail behind the island, we put some shells out on Montana. Once again, we are still sticking with the HE for right now, just to kind of investigate what kind of damage over time we can do. We have probably burnt his Damicon, so if somebody else were to start shooting at him, that would be useful for our team, but maybe not necessarily useful for us. Thanks to our 360 turrets, we are able to pretty quickly get our guns on target for Grosse Kurfürst. land a shot while not spotted, and usually I figure that the average GK is going to have about 10.5 kilometers. Secondaries, I admit that sometimes that might be underestimating the actual physical possibility, and now is one of those times. The 4,000 damage that we get with the AP is not super impressive there. You can see GK is functionally at about a 45-degree angle when he was hit by those, and I'm aiming pretty high in hopes of getting anything. Really, I should probably be on HE at this point, but such is life. He does go down, but it does look like we're about to lose our Yamato, which will not help anything. And that will put us in the somewhat unenviable situation where there are 4 enemy ships over here, and I am functionally the only person who's going to be able to deal with them, or at the very least closest. Now, one of the strengths of Michelangelo is its potential as a kiter and as a ship that has relatively good armor. I say that relatively good as in you've got the belt to repel most stuff. You've got the casemate, which is also surprising and can bounce anything. And you've also got 40 millimeters on the upper belt, which means that you really don't have any part of the main body of your ship that can't bounce something like a Montana. Now, we did get spotted, and the betting man would say that the destroyer is probably somewhere around here. And if I were the destroyer, I would be headed towards C, which obviously they were also. And the reason why we turn out there is initially just to frustrate any potential incoming torpedoes, without really trying to guess how far it is from me to the unspotted destroyer. I just figure if I drive like a maniac, that'll probably make up most of the difference, and it'll be probably pretty hard to hit me, especially if I'm making myself narrow. We do get lucky there with the fire, and now we're going to complete the second half of the serpentine maneuver. And as we do that, we're going to train our guns, and our hope is to hit somewhere around the tower or the bridge. Still turning. Please be patient. Apparently there was some part of our ship that was in the way of that, so that's one of those times where the layout of the ship can be a bit inconvenient. So let's hope that a couple seconds of extra burning isn't life or death for somebody, but we did do most of the things that we wanted there. To be completely honest, it's not looking real good for our battleship here. My thoughts are that I should stay with him, even if it means bearing the shame of hitting the Jean Barriere and appearing to be one of those players who might not be interested in playing the game. But while we're doing this, we're going to hit one of our special buttons. And for a second, we hope that we can sort of conceal our GK here inside of a smoke screen. It may seem a little bit silly. I don't know if he really noticed that he was in a smoke screen, and I don't really know if he has will to rebuild anyway. It's not as powerful as it once was, but free hit points is free hit points, as they say. And certainly the longer he's in the game, the better. He does get one extra shot out there, but unfortunately that is his end. We take advantage of our exceptional smoke firing penalty, which, if we were to cut back to that screen that has all the other ranges on it, does indeed say 7.4 for some reason. Any other battlecruiser would be spotted for shooting right there. You can see we repel almost all of that damage from the Montana. That's because he's hitting center ship, and we've got lots of armor there to take care of that. And the fire ends up taking him out. Now, in defense of how I'm playing this ship, or in justification for how I'm playing this ship, however you want to take it, really. If I was shooting SAP at the front of a battleship can kind of be a tricky affair. You tend to hit different parts of ships that can bounce the SAP or shatter the SAP if you don't have the pen to get through it, like the front of turret faces. So it can be really, really unreliable. You can get good damage, but, you know, there's nothing quite like cooking a battleship. And if we're going to pretend to be a cruiser, we might as well enter that profession. Now, I'm a bit surprised by this, but we do spot the Sumner. He does immediately begin to smoke. And now he's shooting at us. And we're just trying to get our turrets around. And that barely counts as a blind fire, but indeed we could not see him when we shot. And thanks to our crazy driving, we do manage to dodge some more torpedoes. Like I said in the stats section, Michelangelo, for all of its strengths and weaknesses, is not an unmaneuverable ship. So, you know, it moves as cruisers do. And at this point, you see there's just the one ship on the enemy team, which is a Minotaur. We're ready to, well, we were ready to deal with him once he came around the island. It looks like he made an aggressive docking maneuver, and so most likely he'll probably back up. We turn our ship around a bit, and obviously now wouldn't be a bad point to mention the 360 turrets again. I guess it's a bit of convenience to sort of spare you from all of the other inconveniences of the ship. And the really keen-eyed will have noticed that this was not a part of the design I posted in the history. But in the interest of our team winning the game, I do capture the base again. We try to get off a free cheeky shot at the Minotaur. I would like to think that that would have worked, but my concealment with Mim Belly here is just 9.6, so he would have spotted me as I came around the corner anyway. At this point, he's going to cross into secondary battery range, and it's going to be, absent my intervention, a question of whether or not my secondaries can defeat him before his torpedoes get to me. But if there's anything that Michelangelo is truly good at, it is shooting light cruisers. So we put a salvo into him, finish him off with the Dev Strike, and that's the end of the game, which means it's time for closing thoughts. Those who followed my channel probably know that I generally like the bizarre gameplay of Italian ships. They tend to have a pretty unique and often pretty questionable set of consumables that can be used offensively or defensively for comedic effect. And I'm not even saying it's one way or the other. It's almost always both, as needed. Italian ships also tend to be relatively stealthy, which I love. By and large, Michelangelo checks all of those boxes for me. And I've had pretty good luck and or skill when using this ship, but I just find this ship frustrating to play. And I think it's almost entirely the turret arrangement. The other half of it is, if I did want to play this as a secondary ship, I just hate the penalty, and it really just makes me want to go do something else. If you're looking at this, you're just going to have to guess whether or not you're one of those people who are used to literally every other ship in the game that can shoot forward, and the vast majority of them that can shoot backwards too, and whether this novel inconvenience is going to annoy you. I do like the experiences I've had when I got to push into a favorable range, an angle against ships that I could punish, especially without the knowledge of that target, but it's much more likely that you're going to want to fire over your bow or your stern, and you have to finagle the boat so that you can do that. And that's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. It's definitely not mine. And I think it's a really odd choice for a campaign ship. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Hope you've enjoyed the video. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.